Okay, this little video is just going to take you through the nature of the nerve impulse. So the nerve impulse is, how it's presented always is as a graph called an action potential spike, and it's a pretty typical shape, and it's the same for all nerve cells, and it's the same height for all nerve impulses. So what this actually means is we're looking at what's happening to a nerve impulse, as you know, is electrical in nature, is the electrical difference between the inside of the axon and the outside of the axon. Now what it is it's just that difference at that particular place in the axon as that nerve impulse is being transmitted along. So you could have had, this could be the stimulus over here, it's been travelling along and travelling along. If you put the electrodes in that place there, this is what you'll get as that impulse goes past. So we're measuring the difference in charge, if you like, between the fluid that's outside of the axon and the axon cytoplasm, which is called the axoplasm. So they're actually sticking the electrode inside of the cytoplasm of the axon and then comparing it to what's outside of the axon. So that's where the data, the graph, is coming from. Now what you need to know is how that relates to the movement of ions. So the movement of ions is causing this difference in charge across the membrane. It's the potential difference across the membrane. So we're going to look at this bit of the membrane in detail. So you'll remember from core component, that a membrane consists of a phospholipid bilayer, which I've drawn in black, with a number of protein components. And in the axon membrane, we're talking about a series of ion channels and ion pumps. So here I've drawn a sodium-potassium pump, and for the sake of completeness and because I'm a bit retentive, I've put those in sort of a turquoisey colour, and throughout the diagrams, wherever I'm looking at a channel that will allow potassium ions through, I'm going to do it in purple, and where I'm looking at channels that will allow sodium through, I've done them in pink. Now these channels are special. Not only are they specific to the ions, so you need a separate channel for potassium and a separate channel for sodium, is that these channels are what we call gated. That means that the protein kind of curves round, and that gate can be shut or it can be open. Not only are they gated and can be shut or open, but they are what we call voltage gated. And this applies to the sodium channels as well. Now voltage gated means that when the charge inside of the axon hits a certain level, they will open or close depending on the voltage. So depending on that difference in charge. The same applies to the sodium ion channels. They're also voltage gated, then they will open or close depending on what's going on with the charge inside of the axon. The sodium-potassium pump is different. It's an antiport pump, so it means it's going to take things in two different directions. And what this pump does is it utilises ATP, and it moves sodium ions in one direction and potassium ions in the opposite direction at the same time. And I'll just put a little red lightning bolt to remind us that that's using ATP to do that. So those are the proteins in the axon membrane that we're going to be looking at, and you need to really know at each stage of the nerve impulse what's open, what's shut, what's moving, what's not. So when the nerve is not conducting an impulse at all, So it's just resting, hanging around, doing its thing. It's actually in a condition that we call polarised. Now that means that there is a charge difference between the inside, the axoplasm, and the outside, and it means that the axoplasm has a charge of minus 70 millivolts relative to the outside. And by relative, I mean, like, you know, if you compared how much money Richard Branson has than me, he's got lots more and I've got lots less. It's a relative. I'm comparing myself to Richard Branson, which is possibly a foolish thing to do. So it's a relative and not an absolute value. You need to know the number, minus 70. You need to know that that is the resting potential, and we would describe that membrane as being polarised. And you need to know how that happens. So the first reason is that our sodium-potassium pump, helpfully drawn in turquoise, is moving 3 sodium ions out to every 2 potassium ions in. So already you can see that if, you know, I was pushing 3 pounds that way and 2 pounds this way, that this person is going to be a lot richer than this person. They're going to have a lot less money. So this is going to build up a positive charge on the outside and leave this one relatively negative to the tune of minus 70 millivolts. And it is slightly exacerbated by the fact that although the sodium ion channels at minus 70 millivolts are closed completely, so our sodium ions building up outside of here can't get back through. So I'll just, shall I do them in pink? I'll do them in pink. So our sodium ions would love to diffuse back through because there are loads of them on the outside, but they can't because the channel's shut, the door's closed. Whereas potassium ions, you're building them up on the inside, but you can see that that gate is very slightly open. It's a bit what we call leaky. You'll often see that term used, and therefore we're getting some of those potassium ions diffusing out along their concentration gradient. Overall, however, we have a higher potassium ion concentration inside the cell, which makes it low outside, and we've got a high sodium ion concentration outside of the cell. So overall, minus 70 inside, because we're moving more positive ions outside than we're moving in. So that's the resting potential, and on the graph, of course, this would be at minus 70. And as long as the nerve wasn't doing anything, it would stay at minus 70. So what happens when this nerve impulse actually goes past to produce this lovely little action potential spike? So when this nerve is doing nothing, that would be at a resting potential, but as this action potential comes past, it's suddenly spiking up to plus 40. And we need to know what causes that. So if we look at the action potential membrane, we've got the outside here and the axoplasm here, and the axoplasm is going to rise to plus 40 millivolts. And the reason for that is that if we have a stimulus of some description, so it's either the bit of membrane beforehand has just had an action potential, or possibly something stimulated a receptor, that the sodium ion channels start to open. And if the sodium ion channels open, remember we've got high sodium ion concentration out here, they will diffuse into the axoplasm because you've got high concentration to a low sodium concentration. and it will be rapid. And the reason that it will be rapid is because of the concentration difference. Suddenly all the gates are open and it can all rush in, and also the positive charges are attracted to that minus 70 millivolts. Now that voltage, all of these voltage gated channels will only open fully. So remember that we said that we're voltage gated, depends on the charge. So they'll only open fully if the axoplasm hits minus 55 millivolts. This is called the threshold. So if you can imagine a receptor for pressure, say, in your hand, and the air pressure goes up a little bit, your pressure receptors would detect that. The sodium ion channels would start to open, and a few sodium ions might leak in, but it's not really a very strong stimulus, and so they sort of snap shut again. It's not really enough. It might only go up to, minus 69.5, and they're going to snap shut again. If you've got a very strong stimulus and somebody sort of pokes you on the hand with a sharp pencil, then you're going to get more of those sodium ions channels opening, and more of them are going to leak in. As soon as it hits minus 55, all the floodgates open at once and those flood in. So they diffuse in very, very rapidly. And on the graph, what that causes is that action potential spike. It's suddenly going from minus 70 up to plus 40. So this is suddenly going to get much more positive on the inside. Now, in order to respond again, we have to get it back to how it was in the first place. We have to get it back to resting potential. And we call that phenomenon repolarization. So remember, I said that in the resting potential, the membrane is described as polarized. If we make it then positive on the inside, we've depolarized it, and now we need to repolarize it. We need to get it back to the start. Now again, this rests on these gated channels. So at just below plus 40 millivolts, but we'll call it plus 40 millivolts, the sodium channels close. So they snap shut, and that means that the sodium stops flooding in to the axoplasm. The potassium ion gates, on the other hand, at plus 40 millivolts, they open. And if you remember, we said that the concentration in the axoplasm of potassium ions was high on this side and low on that side. So the reverse is going to happen. So before we had the sodium ions rushing in, and now the potassium ions are going to diffuse out rapidly. So we're now losing positive ions from the axoplasm, and so where our action potential has gone up to plus 40, it's now going to go back down, and it's going to repolarize. Now sadly, potassium ion gates shut a lot more slowly than sodium ions do. They're a bit more creaky, and because those gates are open for longer, we get this sort of slight overshoot, and the potassium ions are still moving out at that stage. So they're increasingly slowly, but they're still moving out. They hit a low point. I was going to say nadir then, and I realised you wouldn't know what it meant. A low point at about minus 90 maybe, or minus 80. This is called hyperpolarization. Because the membrane is more hyperpolarized than it was before. So polarized at minus 70, more polarized at lower numbers. And then everything restores back to normal, so our potassium ion channels close so that they're only leaky now. The sodium potassium pump kicks in again, and we're back to the beginning of resting potential, all ready to go again. So let's just have a look at that notion of threshold. So, here's my little graph of threshold. If the stimulus is very small, only a few sodium ion channels open, they don't let enough in to reach this magical minus 55. If it's sub-threshold but a bit bigger, it'll let a few more sodium ions in, still not met it, and those gates just shut and the resting potential is restored again. If we get a threshold stimulus, enough sodium ions go in to reach minus 55, suddenly all of those sodium ion channels open, big influx of sodium ions, repolarize. If it's even more than the threshold, so it's letting in a lot more sodium ions, it reaches threshold, we still get the same size. That's called the all or nothing law. We get the whole thing up to plus 40, or nothing at all or nothing law. Which leaves us with the problem of, well, how on earth then do we distinguish between somebody stroking your cheek and slapping your face? And it's all to do with the frequency. So if you've got a supra-threshold stimulus, love that, and it's only just above threshold, you might get impulses that go like this, all the same size, notice. But if it's a big slap on the face, they'll just get more frequent. You'll get more of them per unit time, remembering that this is in milliseconds and not in seconds. So, all or nothing law, you get the whole thing or nothing at all. The action potential is always at plus 40, and we need to remember our membrane potential, and we need to remember that threshold needs to be met. Okay, hope that's helped.